there's the Defend Forward, there's the robust cyber defense, and then there's the cybersecurity through enforcing norms. Basically, things other than necessarily cyber, but could also be things like indictments or sanctions and other types of things that may not have a cyber response, but would shape the cyber ecosystem through norms. So it was time well spent. I said that at the commission, that it's really how Congress should function in a lot of ways, because we had robust bipartisan debate. It was all about focusing on the mission, the goal of how do we better protect the country in cyberspace, and put forward an overall guiding document and strategy that would be robust and enduring.
You mentioned this variety of concepts, right, and thinking about various forms of deterrence in the discussion. What was the logic behind these 6 pillars, the way the report was condensed? Given how many topics there are in cybersecurity and cyberspace, why pick these 6 as the main representatives?
Yeah, and it was really distilled from down basically our discussion around the different types of strategies that we could and would take. And we recognized that we had done a good job, if you will, of deterring cyber attacks, if you will, above the threshold of armed conflict, but that we needed a new focus because many of our enemies or adversaries, bad actors, were going unchallenged in the threshold below armed conflict, in the gray zone conflict, if you will, which is really all cybersecurity. And so we designed the 6 pillars around that construct, if you will. So recognizing the primary goal is defending forward when necessary, but also strengthening our cyber security through our own measures that can be taken on the defensive side, and then what can we do with international cooperation? So that's kind of what it was designed around, if you will.
The core logic. And looking at the report, what would you say you were most excited to see contained in there? Are there any hidden nuggets whose time has long since come for you?
Yeah, so one of the things that there's a couple of things I guess I'd say that I was excited about. For the last several years, I've been on this kick of how do we really quantify what makes stronger cybersecurity? And I ask this of any number of individuals all the time. It was always kind of gnawing in the back of my mind. Okay, let's say everybody adopts the NIST framework. How much more secure does that get us, for example? Or if we put a new technology on our networks, how much more secure are those networks? And if you're thinking of a CEO that's going to make these decisions based on the recommendations from either the CISO or the CIO, and you've got to defend this decision before the board or your shareholders, there really isn't a framework really for quantifying that, if you will. So one of the things I was really excited about is creating the information and incentive structure for the private sector to better value cybersecurity and really make business decisions that reflect that. So one of the more exciting things for me, anyway, maybe I'm too much of a geek and a nerd on this stuff, but it's creating the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. So basically, we can't understand what we can't measure. And again, currently, there's a dearth of robust and consistent data. So what we're looking at here is the Bureau of Cyber Statistics recommendation proposes that we set up really an independent agency within the Department of Commerce that would collect, process, analyze, and really disseminate the statistical data on cybersecurity, on cyber incidents, and the cyber ecosystem. And why this is so important is that it would do proper legislation construct.
Spalding, who is also a member of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and is currently Senior Advisor for Homeland Security and Director for Defending Democratic Institutions project at the Center for Strategic International Studies, Previously, Ms. Spalding served as Undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security, where she led the artist formerly known as the National Protection and Programs Directorate, now called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Sitting next to her virtually is Dr. Josephine Wolf. Josephine is an assistant professor of cybersecurity policy at Tufts University at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's a non-resident fellow here with us at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council and is a recurring contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. And then finally, Ms. Alyssa Starzak. Alyssa is the head of public policy at Cloudflare. Prior to joining Cloudflare, Alyssa served in a variety of national security positions across the U.S. government, most recently as the 21st General Counsel of the Department of the Army. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us. And let me come right out and ask, the congressman gave us a couple of things to be positive about and thinking about the way that this commission came out. As you look at the report and you're thinking about implementation, what do we need to see done tomorrow? If you had to pick one thing out, had to pick one particular recommendation to push to the absolute top of the list, I hear the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, which I'm fascinated by. For the three of you, what would make the top of your list as the short-term priority? Why don't we start with you, Suzanne?
Thank you, Trey, and thank you to Congressman Langevin, it was just such an honor and really a joy to serve on this commission with such a expert in cybersecurity, somebody who's been working in the trenches for such a long time and brought just really tremendous insights to our conversation. So, Congressman, great to see you virtually and know that you're doing well, and thank you again for that terrific introduction and description of the commission report. I do think that one of the most important things that we have in there, and I hope this doesn't sound too parochial, is strengthening both CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the other important sector-specific agencies. Because as you say, if there was something that could happen tomorrow that would really make a difference, I really do think that is one of the things that can happen most quickly. There's also a recommendation to look at DoD's force structure, and I think that's also important. We talk about in the report this notion of layered deterrence, and Trey, I want to come back to that because I know there's a lot of discussion about how deterrence works and if it can work in cyber. But one of the most important things that we emphasize is not just imposing costs, but denying benefits. And that's, I think, one of the most important things, building resilience and shaping the ecosystem. And that risk management piece is really what CISA and the SSAs are about.
Josephine?
So thank you so much for having me. This is really great to get to see all of you, even in this format. And I think this is a really exciting report. There's so much going on in it. The things that I'm most excited about because of the kinds of work I do have to do with the insurance recommendations and trying to think about how we can stabilize and improve some of the cyber insurance offerings that are being sold and probably being sold in even larger numbers at this moment as companies are increasingly reliant on working from home and remote work. If I were going to choose one thing to really look at tomorrow in the short term, I would say probably the funding for the Election Assistance Commission is the thing that seems most urgent, most pressing, and a lot of the others seem really important, strike me as really sort of pressing recommendations, but perhaps can be imagined over a slightly longer term implementation period.
Alyssa?
So I would actually go in a slightly different direction. I actually think that there are two pieces to it. The things that can be done quickly, there's a few things on the technical side. So that, for example, the securing protocols piece are actually things that we do have solutions for that could be done relatively quickly. So I'd sort of put that one to the top of the list. But I'd also say that to me, some of the more meaningful things are long-term. So it is things like the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, thinking about what the ecosystem looks like in the overall picture, thinking about how we build systems that reflect cooperation, but also reflect international norms. Because to me, the sort of meaningful aspects long-term on all of these issues is going to be what this ecosystem looks like, not just domestically, but internationally. And it is actually really important that we start building up the tools for those norms.
Hey, Trey, I think you're muted.
Got it. Sorry, I just caught that. So I'm curious for this group. There's been a lot of discussion, and I love these contributions. I think the liability and the provisions around reforming Congress, thinking about strengthening the oversight as well as the capacity mechanisms within USG. But I'm curious, I didn't hear anybody mention the industrial base strategy. And this is something that's been in the discussion and in the water in a tremendous way over the last 12 to 18 months. Looking, Congressman and Ms. Spalding, to you to start, and then to the panel, what would you want to see as part of that industrial base strategy, and what was the logic on including it along with these other 81 recommendations?
So I think what we the premise behind this is recognizing that the private sector in and of itself may not be able to look strategically enough, far enough down the road to create the technology solutions that we're going to need for the future. I look at 5G as the example. I think we were not focusing on that long-term thing, where China obviously did a much better job of dominating the market space and having controlling the various components. And now we're left with trying to figure out, how do we work around their dominance in the field, where the commission already talked a lot about the power of free and fair competition to breed innovation and bring positive outcomes, but we're really falling short when it comes to the long-term goal of ensuring that we things like trusted supply chains, as well as the availability of critical information and communications technology. So really, we want to really operationalize the strategy. We wanted to propose to amend the DPA, Defense Production Act, really to expand the definition of national defense and industrial services, really to mitigate dependencies on foreign sourced information and technology strategy. So, basically, we're calling for is a plan to identify critical dependencies and to invest in information communications technology, industrial capacity, really, and reinvigorate our R&D to ensure trusted suppliers of critical technologies. So, just in close, like I say, in practice, this means things like we need to do the research to understand what the next generation critical technologies will be, and then we need to identify the supply chains for such technologies, and then we need to basically be willing to invest in those supply chains, either domestically or among our trusted partners and allies, so we're not caught off guard for the going down the road in the future.
Yeah,
Open that to the rest of the group.
Trey, the Congressman has obviously gotten that exactly right, and I think it's important to emphasize we had a lot of discussion about this, and there's a reason that we use lowercase on industrial policy, because it's there are a lot of folks think they know what industrial policy means, and we tried to be very clear about the kinds of things that we're talking about, as the Congressman said, when we talk about industrial based policy. And I think one of the reasons you didn't hear it in the answer to your first question is that it is not something that you can flip the switch and have happen tomorrow. It is a longer term strategy that needs to be implemented. I would, if I could, going back to your first question, one of the things I guess I would add to that list that wasn't said is the National Cyber Director. I think right away we need to reinstill someone who has the authority and the ability to coordinate cyber activities that have to be and are inevitably spread out across the entire government.
I would second that as well, Suzanne. I'm glad you brought that up. Very important to have that coordinated strategy, and you look at the need to have a real whole of government approach on election security for the 2020 elections. You can see the real value add that a cyber director that's Senate confirmed with policy and budgetary authority could really make sure that we have all the oars moving in the same direction. and it's also the national face, if you will. We need a point person that the country looks to on cybersecurity matters. In the same way on the operational side, we look at the director of CISA for our operational aspects of cyber. We want to have someone that's point person, that's the face of the country on the policy that we need to get right for the country and to lead forward to a stronger place in cybersecurity.
Let me ask the group. So looking at the 7 recommendations, at least 3 focus on directly impacting practices in the private sector, right? The Labeling and Certification Authority, Cloud Security Certification, and
money to work with these providers, which seems sort of backwards, frankly. I would think that you would actually want it the other way around, where you would want to encourage more people to get certifications in the first place, more entities to be secure, have more competition, where you then have a larger pool of people who can provide secure sets of services. I think that there is sort of that broader set of challenges, though, where these are areas where we really are not US only. We are international. We need to think about international cybersecurity certifications that meet different countries' standards, and we need to work together. And the government has a very important role in making sure that those are cross-border certifications, not just US only.
For the 2 commissioners, this is something, again, that got competed with a number of different areas and focal points of recommendation. Why, as the recommendation that we see around cloud certification now, why wasn't this stronger? What was the logic on including it in the way that it's written? Potentially, why not make it weaker? Why was this the sort of equilibrium point for the recommendation?
So I guess I can start here. We want to take the burden off of the small businesses, even cities and towns or states, and having to be responsible necessarily for their own cybersecurity, but we want to incentivize moving to places that secure what we believe to be secure entities like the cloud. So it's really important to understand how the cloud security certification sits at the broader Pillar 4 recommendation and how it relates to layer cyber deterrence, if you will. So I guess one of the fundamental concepts of Pillar 4 is that of cybersecurity enablers, and these are the entities that themselves make up cyberspace. You think of the internet service providers or cloud companies, and so Pillar 4 basically posits that these cybersecurity enablers are really key to strengthening the whole cyber ecosystem. And so we call for stronger cloud certifications, as we want to make sure that we can take the burden off of small businesses and cities and towns, let them migrate the data. The Congress, by the way, should help in some ways to incentivize that move, but we also need to have a certification process so that the cloud providers themselves are making sure that they are showing that they are secure themselves, and they're investing in that aspect of their service that they're going to be providing to these smaller entities to build confidence that the data is going to be secure.
And Trey, you asked why wasn't it stronger, if you will. I mean, there was, to be candid, there was conversation about, should we regulate this? Should we require that they meet certain standards? And we put a lot of emphasis in the commission on trying to use the market, a recognition that the market is generally the most efficient and effective way to kind of drive this process. And there are times, what we did is we tried to look at where the market is failing right now. Why is the market failing? Are there things we could do to help the market to be more efficient? And that's what a lot of those recommendations, whether it is things like the Bureau of Cyber Statistics providing data, lots of different ways in which we are trying to provide information to make the market more efficient, providing transparency to make the market more efficient. The recommendations around cyber insurance are about trying to make the market more effective and efficient here. And in this instance, with the cloud providers, the sense was at the end of the day that if we provide information via this certification, so the certification is really about providing the purchasers of cloud services with information to make the right decisions, wise decisions from a risk management perspective about cloud service providers to use. And so at least that's part of the thinking behind, in this case, state, with, and in this
certainly, but very much in a consultative role makes a lot of sense. In the context of standards development,
went through the rest of the report. But our whole of nation emphasis was really about making sure that we are bringing all of the instruments, for example, of national power to bear. So in the pillar around the use of our instruments of power and our discussion around Defend Forward, for example, which is a DoD concept that is very much about using the military instrument of power. We said we like this concept of not sitting back and waiting, but kind of that persistent engagement and creating that friction that we hope imposes costs in cyberspace. But we want to make sure that we're looking at this from a whole of nation perspective, bringing all of our instruments to bear here, including law enforcement, including sanctions, all of the things that we can bring to bear. So I think that's where the emphasis on whole of nation was meant to broaden, not narrow. It's not whole of nation, meaning America can go alone.
Yeah, and Jay, I want to thank you for your work too, and to add to Suzanne's comments and our appreciation for the work, your input on this. And Pillar 4 is probably maybe turn out to be the most important, but it's all together with
the council is going to be critical for that person. And then, that's the one leader, man or woman who can provide the ensure that the national cyber strategy is implemented in terms of policies and budgets by the individual agencies. And you have this integrated approach. And then when I say executable, I mean, I 100% agree with Representative Langevin that, we need the congressional committee reform. I also suspect he agrees with me that it's one of the least likely to occur, despite his own willingness to give up power. I don't think it's shared by 62 other committee rankings and chairmen. So with that said, you need someone the legislative branch can pull in so that at least they can do oversight. It's less desirable to do oversight committee by committee, but to have that integrated oversight that says, is the agency we are looking at as the Homeland Security Committee, is our agency contributing appropriately to the integrated effort? And they can at least you'll get the answer in a piecemeal way in Congress, but you'll get eventually a complete answer. And it's going to be a lot easier to have a Senate confirmed national cyber director than it is to have the congressional committees occur without a dramatic event. So I really think that national cyber director, and the devil being the details of how the legislation fits through Representative Langevin and Senator King's committees and the Armed Services committees, how it comes through. But from my point of view, that's really one of the most critical recommendations.
I'd like to back up what Mark had to say. And first, I want to thank Mark for his leadership as our executive director of the commission. Mark, you were just outstanding and really kept the oars moving in the right direction and pulling us all in the way, moving it along at an accelerated pace that, quite frankly, I was pleasantly surprised that we're able to achieve. Again, because of your insistence, you could tell you came from a Navy background, obviously, so it worked out well. I wanted to just, I wanted to mention on the cyber director, I completely support and agree with what you said, and Suzanne. This really was one of the most important recommendations, and it's something that I've been calling for since 2008. This goes back to my days on the CSIS Commission for the 44th presidency. It was one of our recommendations then, and it carried through now. I've introduced legislation almost every Congress since then, calling for a director's position in the White House, executive office of the president, Senate confirmed that has that policy and budgetary authority, because you really do need someone that can reach across government and compel departments and agencies to do what they should be doing. Our goal with that is, if you think about it, we want to try to prevent the next OPM hack. OPM was an agency that clearly, cybersecurity was not their thing. It's not their responsibility per se, although each of them, each of the agencies right now sort of do have their own responsibility for cyber, but they didn't understand the value of the data that they were responsible for protecting. A cyber director, consent and confirmed position that can reach across government would have that understand, that visibility and that focus, that sole focus to get a stronger cybersecurity across government.
I'm curious, for this group, there's a discussion about labeling and security attestation as one of the drivers for a more informed marketplace. And I think the point that Suzanne made earlier, right, there's a recurring theme of trying to help the market make more informed security decisions. But the notion of labeling and specifically evaluating the security of products is not new. And so I'm curious, for the group that's been part of this discussion, as well as the panelists, I think, who've heard and lived through some of these debates, why is this moment in time opportune to bring this back and try to codify it as a process? Is labeling gotten to the point where we know and can evaluate and can attest to the security of products more effectively? Is it just that we've been missing the authorities and the mechanism? What's the moment here?
I think that the consumer is hungry for that kind of a certification, if you will. You think Energy Star. I think by now most of us understand, if it's got that, that 5-star Energy Star rating, you understand just, perceptually what that means. You're buying a quality product. We don't have that type of a thing for cybersecurity right now, and that's why the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority would be helpful to the consumer as they're buying products, and it would help differentiate products that are, per se, maybe not secure versus those that that have that Energy Star rating, if you will, that gives consumers confidence that they're buying a quality product.
So I really hope that's true, that the consumer is really hungry for this at this moment. I'm probably a little bit more skeptical that it's something consumers are making a lot of purchasing decisions on. And I think over the years, we've seen some of these efforts sort of run into some of the obstacles where it's not clear that's how people are making purchasing decisions, and it's been hard to really have it take off, perhaps in the way that Energy Star, some labeling endeavors in other fields have really worked. So I'm hopeful. I think better labeling would be great. I would like it for myself. I think it's not something that we've done really comprehensively or thoroughly yet around security. I'm also, I think, a little bit wary of counting on it to do too much, because we haven't seen really great evidence that it can fix all of these problems or even some of these problems yet.
Yeah, listen, I think we should temper our expectations. But I think the Congressman's point that we've spent a lot of time over these years now at trying to educate the public about this threat, and I think it has increased consumers' interest in trying to purchase secure devices. And one of the things I've always thought can help this process is if the tech analysts out there who compare for us when we want to buy some new connected device, and we go online and we find the reviews, and we find the write-ups from the tech analysts, and they give us compare all the specifications and the pixels and the what have you. And I think it would be really nice if those tech analysts had a column comparing the privacy protections, the security, characteristics. And one of the reasons I think that hasn't happened is they're not experts in network security. But I think if we gave them a kind of labeling, thing that they could create a column and compare, then consumers would begin to realize, oh, this is something I should be thinking about. This is something I should look for.
And we think about this way. Somebody goes into Best Buy to buy a new router, right? And Best Buy only has so much shelf space. So number one, Best Buy, as a purchaser of these equipment, they're going to sell these pieces of equipment. They're going to sell to the public. They are, I would think, more likely to put products on the shelves that are that have a certification on them. Number one, and then the consumer coming in can look among the various products that are offered on the limited shelf space and make a determination. Do you want to buy one that has a higher Energy Star / cybersecurity rating versus something that does not? You know, for myself as a consumer, I would think I'm going to look at and want to get the one that has the highest rating that offers the most security. And you don't have to be an expert in cybersecurity to say, okay, I place trust in Best Buy and the decisions that they're putting on their shelves, and therefore I am going to buy, and the certification process that once it becomes kind of universally accepted in the same way that Energy Star is recognized, that a consumer is going to gravitate toward the one that is more secure if they're, if that's something that's on the priority list for them.
I would add actually on the device side, there are a range of consumers. So if you add that with some of the business provisions, so if you imagine that businesses themselves are actually also buying devices, all sorts of potentially connected devices, and you think about the federal government as a procurement authority, for example, there's a whole range of things where certification may come into play that will impact the smaller consumers as well. So if businesses are buying sort of large sets of equipment that are that have a higher security certification, for example, because it might be good for them, that will also potentially have a rolling down effect for consumers on a more individualized basis. So some of it is thinking about what buying patterns look like for different kinds of devices that might themselves be insecure, and thinking about how that certification process can play both in government procurement, but also business procurement. And then on the consumer side, the other thing I would add is that one of the things that there's a lot of effort to do is just to make it easy for people to understand, and that is a potential benefit of labeling. I think that frankly, one of the challenges on the security side is often what you see are the security vulnerabilities are external to the individual. So it's not that their privacy is necessarily at issue, but that the device, for example, could be used as part of a botnet, or and something that they might not themselves experience. It's hard to make that seem personal, and I think that's long been one of the challenges. If you just have it as sort of an Energy Star rating on security overall, which incorporates both your sort of your privacy of what's the device has access to and security, it may actually help address some of the fact that it's actually not applied to you, and so that may be a long-term benefit to the extent that people do make decisions on those bases.
This is an interesting problem, this distinction, right, in terms of purchasing for your own security versus the security of the ecosystem writ large. Although I and I love, and now I'm sort of sorry I didn't see in Best Buy We Trust as the mantra for this section. Let me push back a little bit, because I think this is a really central theme here, is empowering the market, and so the labeling authority becomes a really big piece of that. Energy Star in some appliance sections and segments is almost a default factor, right? So it doesn't become a major differentiator in purchasing decisions because it was seen to be a positive thing, because it was something that consumers were gravitating to. It became a de facto standard for certain sections of the industry. And you saw a lot of this same struggle with the LEED certification, right? Not having at least LEED bronze became a liability for people that were investing in major retail and commercial assets in real estate. So I want to come back to the commission group and rope in John and Rob as well for this. As we're thinking through the notion of certification and labeling, is there a belief that we could make specific enough choices and claims about the security of products, even at an individual level, to substantially differentiate them? And second, how do you fight that sort of labeling creep, right? Creating standards either low enough that everybody can meet them, or flexible enough that they change over time such that effectively everyone becomes compliant.
Thanks, Trey. This is Rob Morgus. I also worked with John and the others on this pillar. So I think it's a good question. And I think the precursor to having effective certification and or labeling is understanding what is good and what is not. And I think we are gradually approaching a place where we have a decent sense of that. I think that a lot of the work that NIST does, for example, can help inform some of this. I think that the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, should it exist in the future, will also help inform some of this. I'm not necessarily ready to say that we are at a place where we have all the benchmarks, the frameworks, and the standards in place just yet to help drive this, but I think that we're working towards that, and that's why, again, in the report, one of the recommendations that we toss out there, and one that we think is crucial for making all of this fit together, is we do need to enable NIST to do far more work that's sort of specifically tailored towards understanding what does and does not work when it comes to product security in what we call sort of critical information and communication technologies. And I think one of the keys here is that we're not asking, at least initially, for a labeling effort to necessarily boil the ocean, but rather to sort of take a very sort of cold, concerted look at what we deem most critical and start with those aspects of sort of ICT.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off Rob here. I think commissioners are really keen on making sure there's a level of consistency and a level of funding towards these efforts, which is why we, put a designation of a labeling authority. Institutionally, the commissioners wanted to make sure that there was an organization that could be doing this and could be pushing this sort of effort, an outlet and an application for NIST's efforts in a broader sense. And then, as a few things of what Alyssa said, making sure that we could target some certifications for a particular market segment or constituency. In this case, commissioners wanted to start with critical infrastructure providers. So the procurement and acquisition, if we were able to have product manufacturers and developers compete for their business by effectively having a certification, because procurement and acquisition personnel are always going to be asking themselves, how can I reduce my supply chain risk? How can I increase security? They have a vested interest in doing that. And we know that the moment is now for that. There's a hunger from them for that now. We imagine that's only going to increase in the future. So that's why commissioners wanted to start there and then expand out to consumer devices, with the acknowledgement that the line between consumer devices and infrastructure ICT is increasingly blurring. So we know there's going to be benefits in the broader consumer market as well. But getting back to the main point, and having an institution, having consistent funding towards an effort that can do this year after year to iterate and develop. I mean, we can't be too risk averse here. We need to try to set a baseline, try to iterate, and try to improve over time. But having an institution that can do that, that's consistently funded, I think, is the key piece that's missing right now.
I want to go to Josephine and Alyssa. I mean, as you guys think about what defines secure product, Energy Star goes through a relatively universal understanding of energy usage and efficiency, and so we can assign values to that and across jurisdictions without too much trouble, although the specifics of implementation become significant. Thinking about the security of a product or a device or a service, what is it your sense of the maturity of assessing the point security of one of these items or products right now? What's our state of development there?
So I think we're still in some ways a long ways off to thinking about some of the criteria that go into it. I do think that there have been some good efforts though underway. So for example, on the congressional side, I know there's been a lot of effort thinking about what an IoT security bill would look like, for example. So what type of criteria are you considering? Do you have to think about what patches look like, for example? How do you push things out? What is the overall system? It's not just about it's the ability to think about what kind of device it is, what the life cycle looks like, and then make sure that you have security patches for it as necessary, depending on the kind of device and again its life cycle. So I think that there's been a lot of thought that's gone into it. I think that the question of what an actual certification would look like is still not quite there.
So I always think about, when we talk about security labeling and certifications, the Ashley Madison complaint that the Federal Trade Commission put out after their breach, in which it turned out that, among many other not particularly savory things they were doing, they had some fake security awards. just little graphics on their website about how incredibly secure they were. And I think, partly that speaks to the way they operated as a business, but partly it speaks to the idea that people have no idea sort of what actual certifications there are, whether there are security certifications, that it's a very easy space to game, or it was then, and I would argue it probably still is now, because people don't have particular labels or particular names that they're looking for. And I think there could be progress made in that regard in terms of sort of whether we know what all the things are to look for when we're issuing those certifications. We know what some of them are. And so I would say, we shouldn't let the fact that we don't know all of them stop us from trying to make some progress, and say, we know that it's important for people to be able to change default passwords. We know that it's important for updates to be automated. We know it's important for, this set of things. I think those are worth trying to identify and label and make transparent. One of the things I think is hard, and I certainly don't know the answer, is how you strike the right balance between telling consumers, this is a green light, this is an A+, this is something good, and leaving it there, versus trying to break it down a little bit more for them. And obviously you don't want to go really deep in the weeds, but I think there are a lot of different dimensions when you're thinking about security. And I would probably personally be in favor of trying to experiment a little bit with whether there are ways to break out a couple different categories or a couple different pieces of that, rather than just saying, okay, here's your one score, here's your one label, your one grade. I don't know enough about sort of the energy labeling world to have a sense of how many different components there are that go into that Energy Star label, and sort of how much of it is just efficiency versus 17 other things. My gut instinct, and anybody should feel free to contradict me, is that it's a little bit more straightforward, that there's sort of a clearer sense of what it means to be energy efficient than there is, at least right now, around what it means to be secure. And so I think there may be some complications when we try to sort of come up with something really simple, really easy to understand, but that also takes account of, is this a threat to your privacy? Is this a threat because you could become part of a bot? Is this a threat for 7 other different dimensions that we want people to look at? And I don't know how you strike that balance between being transparent, informing people, but also not overwhelming them.
So I'm curious to ask, as we've got Congressman Langevin and several staff in the panel here, the commission has a focus, although I think not exclusively, on U.S. government and the U.S. marketplace for these technologies. Most of these companies that we're talking about trying to shape the behavior of are global firms. So I'm wondering if you could characterize the folks involved with the commission, the discussion for us internally about how much of the report needed to versus could carry across jurisdictional boundaries. And then for the panel, as you're looking at the report and the recommendations, particularly in the ecosystem section, how many of these flow very easily into the market as you see it right now? How many of them are going to run smack up against regulatory barriers to start? Why don't we start with the congressman and then go to the staff?
I'm sorry, do you have to do a repeat on that?
Not a problem. So just looking if you could characterize the discussion internally about the degree to which the report needed to be transatlantic and global in nature versus thinking about it as focused on the U.S. market.
So for me, I started the premise of this is, it can't just be U.S. centric, that we have to take a more of an international focus and have international partnerships. Again, it goes back to something I've said for years, not just a U.S. problem. Cybersecurity is really a challenge for all of us, and we need partners and allies to get to a stronger place in cybersecurity than where we are right now. So obviously, the U.S. national security, in my mind, from my vantage point, has to come first, and it's essential. It's what I do representing my constituents. But to get there, it can't just be U.S. only. It has to be an international effort. Just like we look at security more broadly, we are stronger when we are cooperating on an international basis, and it's not just U.S. only going it alone.
It's helpful, and 5 points to the congressman for mentioning the Atlantic Council's catchphrase, stronger with allies. Mark, going to you next.
So, from our perspective, I think it was really about building, we believe you need to have the international thing because the international engagement, because you needed to do this with the coalition of the willing. I mean, there is an element to international engagement that's more open and trying to include even potentially adversaries, but really it was about building this coalition. And you needed that for a few things. One was attribution. I mean, if we're going to do attribution properly, we're going to need to be able to work it more rapidly and effectively with allies and partners who have a similar understanding of similar agreement of what happened during an event. And it needs to be faster. If you think about this most recent Georgian one, for us in the Brits to say 4 months later or 3.5 months later that the Russians did that attack is just way too slow. It means you're not going to have any kind of reasonable, timely response that is is effective in tamping down what they might do. And the second is to have an agreement on action. What are the rule sets? To have transparency with your allies and partners of, if we see this, we're going to do that. That kind of, to establish those kind of business rules for operating. And that isn't just about the military, although it quickly gets into a military discussion. It's really about law enforcement activities, sanctions, diplomatic activities, and, if really necessary, military activities, either cyber or non-cyber. So I think to get at the attribution and the agreement on action, you really do have to work carefully with your allies and partners, which means at some point we have to understand what they believe norms and standards are, and come to some kind of compromise with our allies and partners about that. I would say there's also a part to supply chain that's part of this. We have to understand that we are not going to be able to solve the supply chain with just U.S. at this point. The IT hardware industry is so left our country. The research and development and the production of those systems, that we really have to look at the supply chain as the United States and its coalition of partners and allies that build, that agree to a certain level of security in the supply chain. And so I think even when you look at things like the industrial policy, there's an international approach that has to be taken to it. So I think we were pretty consistent in looking at across this effort.
We've been losing the sort of an absence on the policy ground now for a while on the international scale. You look at the EU; they've got GDPR, and we don't have something similar yet here, and we're not playing a forward role in international policy setting. And I think it's a void that is with the U.S. president that's really screaming our absence, and we really do need to be more forward-leaning on the policy setting on the international community than what we have been.
We appreciate that. Let me go to the panelists quickly, because I know we've got one more question before we wrap up here. Further recommendations: what's likely to carry easily? What's going to run smack into a regulatory barrier in your mind? And it may be that none of it is. I'm curious.
I'd like to comment on that last piece a little bit, because one thing that I think Mark didn't include in that set of how do you work internationally does relate to the privacy component. So, one of the challenges, again, for U.S. companies is that if you want to cooperate, you have to make sure you also comply with potentially other international requirements like privacy laws that a U.S. company.
Why not specifically challenge the research community to develop either the technology to support a market for producing this rating, or to provide a technical solution for providing this kind of rating?
Jacob, when you say challenge, you mean a DARPA Grand Challenge type model?
Something like that. Something that's essentially going to see the technical kernel that actually makes producing this rating on the fly, under the assumption that we need to be able to produce this rating on the fly because new exploitations and things like this are always possible.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go to commission staff and then the panelists?
Yeah, this is John. Oh, I forgot this is a video, not a call. I think that's a good point. I think commissioners wanted to keep it at a fairly sort of high level and not get into the specifics of how things would be implemented. So in this case, it would be the chart when you're talking about a labeling authority, telling a labeling authority they'd be responsible for coming up with a regime for a comparative security score, and leaving the details to the labeling authority or departments and agencies, the federal government, on how they see about carrying that out. It doesn't rule out working with working or starting a DARPA Grand Challenge down the road. But I think the goal here is to establish an institution that could carry that water over time, irrespective of how that would be implemented, whether through a DARPA Grand Challenge or otherwise.
That's helpful. Thanks for that, John. I know we're right up against time, so I want to run through Josephine, Alyssa, and then Congressman, if you guys want to give us some closing thoughts.
Sure. So I would say I'm deeply admiring of this report. What I like best about it is that it really, I think, strikes a balance in thinking about where do we need companies and people to really step up when it comes to cybersecurity and do a little more and work a little harder than they have been, and where do they need some support, and how do we provide that from a government perspective, from a partnering perspective. And I think both of those are really much needed efforts to provide support, like the Bureau for Cyber Statistics, information that many private sector entities need to provide certain kinds of certification and labeling, which may help, but also to recognize, and I think you see this most clearly in the liability piece, which you were talking about, that there are a lot of things that we do know companies, people should be doing, and that they're not always doing, and that it may be time to take a stronger stance on that. And so I'm hopeful that this is a report that both acknowledges that there's a lot more we need to do by way of data collection and analysis to understand what the best measures are, but also realizes that we can't wait until all of the data has been collected and all of those things are completely known quantities before we start taking some more serious action to try and have companies and individuals step up and take responsibility for security in this space.
So I agree with that. I also think it's just understanding that the ecosystem component, I'm really glad that that section was in here on the idea of strengthening the ecosystem overall. Thinking really broadly about how we do that, thinking about the low-hanging fruit in that area. Again, going back to sort of the very beginning, protocols that can be secured, pushes in that direction, things that can do, that can have a broad effect across the board that are not, frankly, that hard to implement, I think is important. And I really do appreciate the Commission's look at those issues in addition to everything else. I think that there's one of the things that reading the entire report through shows is just that there's a lot of work still to do. And so it will be a lot of what comes next is how we actually think about taking all those recommendations and moving them forward. And again, making sure that none of them get lost in the process. I think that the challenge on the ecosystem ones is that they are often the ones that could get lost. And in some ways, they are probably the most important, just given the way our cybersecurity posture looks generally. So to me, the next steps are really about making sure that part moves forward along with everything else. Norms development as well. Those are really critical pieces, and often I think they feel a little bit outside the government's control. And so the more we can continue to push on those, the more important they are.
That's fantastic. Thank you both. And Congressman, over to you for any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just close by saying, Trey, thank you for hosting, and thank the Atlantic Council for putting this forum together. I enjoyed the discussion. I thought it was a great opportunity to do a deep dive on some of the specific aspects of the report, which I think, again, give meaningful recommendations for how we get to a stronger place in cybersecurity. The fact that we have over 75 actionable recommendations in the report help us to not only have a blueprint, but an action plan of how we get to the place we would like to get to in cyber. So thanks for the discussion around the forum today. I thought it was really enlightening, and certainly I learned a lot too, as well as hopefully sharing some important information.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you to our panel as well as everyone for attending. We will endeavor to bring you some more after dark events once we're back in a position to do so. But thank you everybody for donating your lunch hour. Hope you got something out. The commission report's available on their website. Also, we have a few other folks pinging questions in the chat, so we're happy to link you guys up with staff if anyone wants to reach out. So thank you again very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.